The story of the little warrior began in a quiet corner of Eastern Europe, far from the grand strategies scribbled on maps in Berlin or London. His name was Stefan, a boy of only 12 years, who had known nothing but war since the age of 6. His village lay nestled between low green hills and winding streams, a place that once smelled of bread, hay, and spring blossoms. But in the summer of 1941, when the German armies swept eastward with their tanks and soldiers in gray uniforms, that fragrance was drowned by smoke, oil, and gunpowder. Stefan's father had been taken away early in the occupation, accused of hiding food from the requisition squads. His mother struggled to keep their small home intact, caring for Stefan and his younger sister. Like many children in those days, Stefan grew up faster than nature intended. He learned where to find food in the forests, how to slip unseen along the hedgerows, and how to listen for the rumble of armored vehicles long before the adults heard them. War sharpened his senses, carving away his childhood. The German presence was constant. Soldiers marched through the village streets, barking orders in a harsh language the locals despised. Trucks rumbled by, carrying ammunition and supplies toward the front. And then there were the tanks, massive machines that seemed like creatures from another world. To Stefan, they were monsters of steel, belching black smoke, their treads grinding the earth. The villagers whispered about them in fear, calling them panzers. Despite the fear, Stefan was not one to bow easily. Something inside him, perhaps, a stubbornness inherited from his father, made him restless under occupation. He watched everything, the soldiers' routines, their weak points, the times when the sentries were distracted. At night, he listened to the hushed meetings of partisans who came down from the hills. They spoke of sabotage, resistance, and the need for courage. Though the adults often dismissed him as just a boy, Stefan absorbed every word like dry earth, drinking rain. One fateful day, while wandering near the forest edge, Stefan stumbled upon a small group of partisans. They were men with tired eyes and patched coats, armed with whatever weapons they could scavenge. At first they were wary of the boy, but his sharpness impressed them. When he described how many soldiers were stationed in the village, where the tanks rested overnight, and when the patrols changed, the men exchanged glances of surprise. The child had seen what they could not, moving unnoticed where an adult would be questioned or shot. "Little one of them said, patting his shoulder, "your eyes are worth more than a rifle." From that night on, Stefan became their scout. He crept through the alleys, overheard German officers boasting in their drunken voices, and counted the fuel barrels stacked near the tanks. His small frame and innocent appearance allowed him to pass beneath suspicion. To the occupiers, he was just a barefoot village boy, chasing shadows. To the resistance, he was a pair of unseen eyes, a silent ally. Yet it was not only bravery that drove him. Inside, Stefan burned with anger. He remembered the night his father was dragged away, his mother crying in the doorway as soldiers pushed her back. He remembered the hunger in his sister's eyes, the endless winter when bread was harder to find than gold. Each day under occupation was another scar etched into his young heart. And so, his scouting was not merely a task, it was a vow, a child's promise to strike back at the monsters of steel. The moment of destiny began to take shape when whispers spread that a feared SS Panzer Brigade was moving toward the area. These were not ordinary soldiers, but Hitler's most disciplined, ruthless, and heavily armed men. Their tanks were said to be invincible, their crews merciless. Villages ahead of them were burned, their people scattered or slaughtered. Terror arrived before the brigade itself. For Stefan's village, this meant doom. Even the partisans hesitated, unsure whether they could stand against such a force. But Stefan, in his restless way, refused to accept hopelessness. He began to wander farther, climbing ridges to watch the roads, hiding among bushes near the fields. And it was he, not the men, who first saw the dust rising in the distance, the dust of hundreds of vehicles, rolling closer like an approaching storm. He raced back to the village with the news, breathless, his heart pounding. The partisans listened, grim-faced. They spoke in urgent whispers, debating whether to retreat into the hills or attempt a desperate ambush. And in that discussion, The boy who had once been ignored now stood among them as an equal. His voice, trembling yet fierce, carried a suggestion that no one had expected. "If the tanks are monsters," Stefan said, "then we must cut off their food." The men stared at him. "Their food?" one asked. "The fuel," Stefan explained. "I've seen where they keep it. Without fuel, the monsters cannot move." In the silence that followed, the partisans exchanged looks of wonder and disbelief. The boy had pointed at the one weakness the mighty machines could not survive without. And so, with a plan forming in their minds, the legend of the little warrior truly began. The day the SS Panzer Brigade rolled into the valley was unlike any other. Long before the villagers saw them, the earth trembled under their treads. Birds scattered from the treetops, and cattle in the fields broke their ropes, fleeing in panic. Then came the sound, an endless growl of engines, as though the hills themselves were groaning in pain. Dust clouds rose like storms on the horizon, and then, one by one, the armored beasts appeared. Stefan watched from a hidden ridge, his small body pressed flat against the grass. He counted them carefully, whispering the numbers under his breath. Dozens of tanks, armored cars, fuel trucks, and columns of grim-faced soldiers stretched across the road like a river of steel. Their insignias gleamed in the light, the black lightning bolts of the SS, feared across Europe. His heart beat fast, but not with fear alone. It was a rhythm of defiance, a pounding drum that seemed to whisper, "They are not invincible." That night, the brigade made camp on the outskirts of the village. The villagers huddled in their homes, shutters drawn, afraid even to breathe too loudly. German voices barked commands, engines roared as tanks were positioned, and fuel trucks lined up in neat rows like lifelines feeding the metal monsters. The air stank of gasoline and oil, heavy and suffocating. Stefan slipped out under the cover of darkness, his feet silent on the earth. He moved like a shadow, weaving between haystacks and fences, until he reached the grove where the partisans were waiting. The men looked exhausted, their rifles old and mismatched, yet when Stefan spoke, they leaned in as though his words were fire itself. He told them of the fuel trucks, the barrels stacked near the tanks, the careless guards laughing around a fire. One of the older men shook his head. "It's suicide," he muttered. "Those are SS. Even we fear them." But another, younger, and harder in the eyes, leaned forward. "The boy is right. Kill the fuel, and the beasts are nothing but carcasses." A plan was born in whispers. The partisans would strike at night using stolen grenades and homemade firebombs. Stefan begged to join them, but the leader refused at first. "You are only a boy." Yet Stefan's voice, calm and steady, carried weight beyond his years. "Who else can move where they cannot? Who else has walked through their camp unseen?" His words silenced the protest. In the end, they gave him a small satchel of bottles filled with kerosene and cloth rags. "Be swift," the leader said, "and may God keep you." The night grew cold. Clouds smothered the moon, cloaking the valley in darkness. Stefan crawled on his belly, inch by inch, until the glow of campfires and the shadows of tanks loomed above him. He could hear the soldiers laughing, their boots crunching on gravel, the metallic clang of tools as mechanics worked late. Every sound was magnified in his ears, but he kept moving, one heartbeat at a time. At last, he reached the fuel trucks. Rows of barrels towered above him, their smell sharp and dizzying. He lit the rag of one bottle with trembling hands, the tiny flame flickering like a secret star in the darkness. Then, with all the strength in his small arms, he hurled it against the nearest barrel. The explosion was instant. Fire leapt skyward, a dragon's roar breaking the silence. The night was torn apart by flames, licking the sides of trucks and racing from one barrel to the next. Soldiers shouted in panic, stumbling from their posts as fire spread like a living thing. From the hills, the partisans opened fire, their rifles cracking in the dark. More firebombs arced through the air, bursting against fuel stores. The camp became chaos. Men screaming, tanks trying to start their engines, only to choke as heat warped their metal. Stefan darted between shadows, lighting and throwing, his small figure invisible in the inferno. But the SS were not ordinary soldiers. Their discipline returned quickly. Machine guns rattled, sweeping the hills, cutting down trees and stone. Searchlights pierced the night, stabbing at the shadows where the partisans hid. The boy barely escaped one beam, throwing himself into a ditch as bullets tore through the ground around him. The battle raged until dawn. By then, half the brigade's fuel was gone, their trucks blackened skeletons of twisted metal. Several tanks lay crippled, their treads melted into the earth. Smoke poured into the morning sky, a dark pillar that could be seen for miles. The price, however, was heavy. Many partisans did not return from the hills. The survivors limped back, weary but defiant, carrying the wounded. When Stefan rejoined them, his face smeared with soot, the men stared in awe. He was no longer a Yugar, child in their eyes, but one of them, a warrior who had walked into the jaws of death and returned. The Germans, enraged, scoured the countryside in revenge. Villages were searched, barns burned, and anyone suspected of aiding the attack was dragged away. Stefan's mother wept in silence, fearing every knock on the door would be their last. Yet Stefan did not regret. For the first time, the monsters had been stopped. For the first time, the invincible had bled. The legend began to spread. Farmers whispered of a boy who had lit the night with fire, who had struck the mighty SS where no grown man dared. Stories traveled faster than soldiers, carried by refugees and partisans alike. Some said he was blessed by angels, others that he was invisible to bullets. In truth, he was still only a boy, his heart pounding with both pride and sorrow. But history had begun to carve his name into its stone, and as the Panzer Brigade licked its wounds preparing to move again, Stefan knew deep inside, the battle was not yet over. Fire had been his weapon once, but to end the terror completely, something greater would be demanded. The Panzer Brigade, though wounded, was not destroyed. Its commanders raged at the humiliation of losing fuel to a handful of partisans and a child. Orders came down from Berlin: punish the countryside, restore fear, crush the resistance. Columns of soldiers spread out, dragging villagers from their homes, torching barns, and lining people up in squares to intimidate them with rifles and barking dogs. The smell of smoke and fear hung over the land like a permanent shadow. Stefan saw it all. From the safety of the hills, he watched his people suffer. His mother's face haunted him, pale and exhausted, clutching his little sister close while soldiers searched their home. Rage burned inside him, but now it was tempered with something colder: resolve. He knew that fire alone would not stop the monsters. They would come again, rolling their steel into villages, grinding resistance under their treads. If the people were to survive, something bolder had to be done. The partisans debated for nights. Some argued to retreat deeper into the forests, to wait until the tide of war shifted. Others, hardened by grief, demanded more attacks. It was Stefan who spoke last, his voice quiet but unwavering. "We must break them," he said, "not just wound them. We must show the world that even the strongest can fall." The plan that followed was daring to the point of madness. The brigade still had one vital supply column moving through the valley, fuel reserves brought from afar, guarded heavily but vulnerable while on the road. If that column could be destroyed, the tanks would become stranded, powerless statues of steel. To attack it meant certain death for many, but it also meant the chance of a miracle. On a cold morning, with mist clinging to the fields, the partisans took their positions. Stefan, though barely 13 now, stood among them with a rifle slung across his small shoulders. He had insisted on joining the ambush, not as a scout this time, but as a fighter. His hands trembled when he first touched the weapon, yet his eyes were steady. The column appeared just as expected: trucks groaning with barrels, motorcycles flanking them, armored cars at the front and rear. The ground shook under their weight, and the soldiers rode with arrogance, convinced no one would dare strike again. They did not know that the hills around them were alive with waiting eyes. The first explosion shattered the morning. A mine buried beneath the dirt road tore through the lead vehicle, flipping it into the air in a burst of smoke and flame. Chaos followed instantly, rifle fire cracking from the slopes, grenades arcing into the convoy. Trucks erupted one after another, their cargo turning into rolling fireballs. Soldiers scrambled for cover, shouting orders drowned by the roar of destruction. In the midst of it all was Stefan. He darted between rocks, his small size making him a phantom on the battlefield. When he saw a soldier aiming at one of the partisans, pinned down, he raised his rifle, breath held tight, and pulled the trigger. The recoil jolted his shoulder, but the man fell. Fear coursed through him, yet with it came a strange clarity. He was no longer a boy watching war. He was inside it, shaping it. The ambush raged for nearly an hour. By the end, the supply column was nothing but twisted wreckage, black smoke spiraling into the sky. The surviving Germans retreated in disarray, leaving their dead and wounded behind. The valley shook with the victory cries of the partisans. But the triumph came at a terrible price. Several comrades lay fallen among the rocks, men who had fought beside Stefan, whose laughter he had known in the quiet of the nights. He knelt beside one, gripping his hand as life slipped away. Tears welled in his eyes, not of regret, but of the heavy weight of war pressing down upon his young heart. The destruction of the convoy crippled the SS Panzer Brigade. Without fuel, their mighty tanks stood idle, hulks of steel rusting in the fields. Orders to advance stalled. The terror that once rolled like thunder through the valley had been silenced by a handful of villagers and one boy who refused to bow. Word of the victory spread faster than the smoke, carried on whispers, then shouted in markets, then printed in secret leaflets. And so the legend was born. Across the countryside, people spoke of the little warrior, the boy who had dared to strike at Hitler's fiercest soldiers, who had walked through fire and steel and returned. Some said he was no ordinary child, but a spirit sent to defend the innocent. Others swore they had seen him vanish like a shadow just before bullets struck. His true name, Stefan, faded behind the myth, but his deeds grew larger with every telling. The Germans tried to erase the story, to silence the whispers, with executions and threats. But legends have a way of surviving even the darkest nights. For every villager who trembled in fear, another stood a little taller, inspired by the tale of a boy who proved that even the smallest hand could change the course of war. Years later, when the war finally ended and the occupying armies were driven out, the valley returned to silence. The fields grew green again, children laughed in the meadows, and smoke once more came only from chimneys baking bread. Among the ruins of abandoned tanks, villagers would tell newcomers of the time when the invincible SS had been humbled, not by armies, but by a boy's courage. Stefan himself never sought glory. To him it was not legend, but memory. The faces of those lost, the fire that had lit the night sky, the endless determination that had carried him forward when fear threatened to break him. Yet whether he wished it or not, his name had become something larger. He was the little warrior, the child who defied the monsters of steel and showed the world that even in the darkest times, courage could burn brighter than fire.